Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today David Schonthal. He is a professor of innovation and entrepreneurship at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, and also co-author of the upcoming book, The Human Element, where we're going to dive into some of the aspects around how innovation works, and especially what can prevent ideas being taken up by companies, customers, and the general market. David, it's wonderful having you here today.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. So, David, for people who don't know about you or your work, could you just give us a brief background as to where you got started and how you got to where you are now?
Sure. So in addition to prior to my work at Kellogg, so I'm a faculty member at the Kellogg School where I teach classes on new venture creation, entrepreneurship, venture capital. My background is in the startup space, working for startup companies and also investing in them as a venture capital investor. And one of the things that always confounded me is, despite the fact that companies I was working for or working with had wonderful ideas that were going to meaningfully change the world when they made its market, despite how on point they were in terms of addressing what customers desired and helping them make the progress they sought, for reasons that I couldn't quite understand, sometimes there were forces standing in the way of what was clearly a good idea. And so got together with one of my Kellogg colleagues, a guy named Loran Nordgren, who's a really talented behavioral psychologist. And together we started putting our heads around, why is it that people say no to what are clearly good ideas? And that was the origin of the book, The Human Element.
So tell us a little bit more about this book. What's it about? What sort of insights can we find in it?
So the book is based on the premise that our instincts about innovation are flawed. That as innovators or as entrepreneurs, we think the answer to getting a new idea to market or a new idea to take flight is to simply make the idea as good as it can possibly be, whether that's a strategy or a product or a service or a public health movement. All we need to do is add features and benefits and magnetism around the idea, and people will say yes. The book highlights the fact that that's one half of the equation, but there's another half of the equation, which are all of the headwinds or forces that oppose change. And these are uniquely human factors. So we diagnose and highlight 4 specific frictions, as we call them, that stand in the way of any new idea. One is the friction of inertia, which is people's natural tendency to stick with what they know. Human beings are creatures of habit, and no matter how good a new solution might seem, it's always being compared with the status quo. And so sometimes that inertia can stop us from making what's clearly a better decision about a new idea. The second is effort, how much perceived or real effort it takes for somebody to make the change to what you'd like them to do. The third is emotion. Even though a new product or service may help people address all sorts of progress and benefits in their lives, it's not without anxiety or concerns simply about switching to that new thing. How well do you understand the anxieties and concerns that stand in the way of that change? And then the fourth friction we talk about in the book is called reactance, which is people's aversion to being changed by others. And what we talk about is each of these frictions are typically present in any change initiative, but oftentimes we're misguided about how we think we can address them and which ones of them are actually at play. So in the book, we talk about not only how to spot these frictions, but also how to overcome and address them.
I'm really looking forward to talking about some of these frictions, especially as they seem to be based on some more biological, psychological, physiological things that people have evolved over time. But what really struck me when you listed out these 4 frictions is none of them seem to be what you talk about when you're developing an innovation or you're planning, doing market research, doing design thinking, where you're thinking, okay, what should this product do? who's it for? What problems do they have? How does it solve it?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason why these classic innovation questions don't seem to have anything with the frictions you've outlined?
I think it's because, first of all, it's for two reasons. We tend to think, so on the other side of friction are the things that oppose change. All of the things that propel people towards change, the recognition that maybe what they're doing today isn't good enough, or there's a new problem that requires a new solution. We refer to those forces as fuel. I think because of being human, we tend to think in fuel because we tend to look at the world through our own lens. So for example, if you're driving down the Autobahn or you're driving down the freeway and you see somebody driving really erratically because we are not in their seat, we observe them and our natural instinct is to say, oh, that person's crazy, or that person's inebriated, or that person is a jerk, or whatever it might be. And we fail to consider that, well, maybe that person is an EMT on their way to an emergency, or maybe that person has to really go to the bathroom and needs to get off the expressway or the freeway as soon as possible. We tend to look at the world through our own lens. And even though many of us who are design thinking trained and design thinkers tend to think in human-centered design, our ideas about human-centered design typically stop at features and benefits. They don't necessarily stop at the introduction of that idea into the market. And so what this book is really about is not just human-centered design for creating products and services, but how do you design the intervention of that thing into the market in a way that is equally human-centered and user-centered?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't agree more. I often say to clients, one of the things which upsets them the most is when I tell them and they realize your customers don't care what you think of your own idea. They only really care about what impact it's going to have on them. And that all boils down to this perceived value, not just the actual value. And some of the frictions you mentioned are very much around perception.
Absolutely.
So let's maybe go into one or two of them. I'm intrigued by this concept of inertia. Let's go a bit more into detail there. What is inertia and the concept of trying to get buy-in around your ideas or innovations or whatever it might be?
Yeah. So again, human beings are creatures of habit. And even though we may know there's a better way to do something or to make the progress we seek in our lives, sometimes the habit of the present is more magnetic than the new solution. Maybe an example that's a little bit of a personal example. My mom, who surprisingly recently decided to get a smartphone. She was using a flip phone for a very long time. And I've got kids, and my brother and my sister have kids, and we're all dispersed throughout the world. She wanted a way to FaceTime with her grandkids and get connected to her grandkids. So naturally, the way to do that was to buy an iPhone and to get an iPhone so that she could interact with us sporadically and serendipitously with the grandkids. And despite the fact that she had a phone that was basically no longer being supported by her carrier, all of her needs, from having a camera on her to having email to having a web browser and having her music, could all be addressed by a smartphone. And iPhones are really user friendly, and it would have been easy for her to learn. It took her a surprisingly long time to get on board with buying an iPhone. And when you talk to her about it, it's not that the iPhone was expensive, which it is. It's not that it was difficult to learn, which it's not. It's not that she couldn't migrate over her contacts and make things really easy. She could. One of the things that stood in the way of her actually buying an iPhone was she already had 3 or 4 chargers for her flip phone. And she had a car charger for her flip phone. And it's like, I know the iPhone is going to do everything I want it to do, but I don't want to have to buy all new chargers, and I don't want to have to plug in new cables into the house. And surprisingly innocuous stuff about the habit of the present, despite how compelling this can be over here. The habit of the present is surprisingly strong. And unless we get people to move away from the habit of a present or the inertia, no matter how sexy or scintillating we make this thing, we're always going to deal with an impasse. And most designers' instincts is, well, let's make this better. Let's lower the price, or let's do a promotion. And they fail to recognize that when they change the offer, now you're adding in new frictions. Now there might be the friction of anxiety or emotion, because now I'm paying for features and benefits I don't need. And so our instincts about having the product be the thing we affect instead of the habit or the forces at play being the thing we affect can lead us down a bottomless pit of expense and feature creep, when in fact the real thing we need to do is help people overcome that inertia.
It's not just the inertia. I think it's I don't know exactly which one of your frictions you listed, but there is a cost that someone needs to undergo when they change themselves as well. And with that change, if you go right down to the psychology of it, there's fear behind it. Quite often, everything comes down to fear.
Yes.
So,
Fear, anxiety. I mean, and it's funny because these are not things that people will just tell you in a focus group. They're not going to say, well, I'm afraid to buy a new piece of technology because I'm going to look like a Luddite, or I'm afraid not to buy this because it's going to make me feel inadequate. Like, those are not things people wear on their sleeve, which makes it a little bit more difficult for an innovator to try to figure out underneath the surface, underneath their surface level answers, what are the real frictions at play.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges. How do you get to the bottom of what these perceived value drivers actually are, especially not just the things that are pulling people towards something, but the frictions which are keeping someone away from it? How would you approach finding out and actually getting to the bottom of what these frictions actually are? What sort of research can you do?
Well, it depends on which frictions are at play, but broadly speaking, a lot of this is similar to what design thinkers and innovators are probably used to, which is ethnographic research, jobs to be done interviews. What we're really trying to understand is the why underneath the what. Not what people say they want to do or what people wish they could do, but why they choose to do it. And so we talk about the importance of ethnographic research in this book and some techniques for doing that. We talk about the importance of empathy research and actually bringing the users of your products or services into the design process, not just in terms of features and benefits, but also in terms of thinking about how this new product is introduced into the world. We give an example from IDEO's work, where I spent 10 years working as a designer. We had a designer on our team, a woman named Barbara Beskind, who when she joined IDEO was 90 years old. She was a retired industrial designer and veteran of design, and had come out of retirement having seen a special on IDEO on 60 Minutes and said, "Oh, I'd very much like to get involved in human-centered design. That seems really interesting." And wrote literally a handwritten letter to IDEO saying, "I'd very much like to come to work for your organization." And I don't know who in our Palo Alto office received that letter, but you receive a letter from this woman saying, "I'm an industrial designer at 90 and I'd like to get involved with your business." Everyone's like, "Yes, please." And so Barbara would spend time on design teams working specifically around topics related to aging. And it wasn't just about how to make user interfaces easier for people with macular degeneration or to make interfaces that were easier for people with arthritic hands or mobility issues. She was also really helpful in helping the team understand how value propositions might be perceived by their intended audience, which frankly is a bunch of 20, 30, 40-year-olds. Like, we can understand the design principles of making something easier to use, but there's no way we can transport ourselves to the mind of an 80 or 85-year-old person who's going to be moving into an assisted living facility on how these products or services may be received emotionally or in terms of the effort related to expense or complexity. And so having Barbara on the team was really helpful for two reasons. Number one, helping us understand the functional needs that people have, but also really understanding more deeply the social and emotional needs they have, and also the emotional friction that might stand in the way of that change. So all of that is to say, to the extent that you can have representative voices on the team, it's not just great for building better things, it's also great for spotting and forecasting the friction that may exist so you can address it up front and it doesn't become an issue down the road.
I think this is actually one of the biggest challenges that innovators have, especially innovators, designers within companies, because a lot of times I've seen these individuals thinking that innovation means you need to be doing something different and therefore show how different and better, therefore, this new product is. And I've got an example from my recent work as well. I'm working in the construction industry with a very innovative firm. And every now and again, I need to tell my marketing team and my design team to put themselves in the mind of the end customer who is not as digitally native as we are. And one example is we were producing a 3D rendered marketing video. And the first rendering which came back, this was meant to be a desk of someone who's going to use our product. And the desk looked like something out of Steve Jobs' office, just clean white lines, perfectly manicured furniture. And it was meant to show how innovative and beautiful the product is. And I said, the people who are going to use this are sitting in cubicle containers on construction sites. They have dirty shoes on their floor. They've got half full coffee cups. And if you show someone something which looks so different from their workplace, it might actually have the opposite effect of what you want. It might say, yeah, it might show them, these people don't understand me and don't understand the way I work and the way I think and the way I feel.
That's
so
right.
You need to put yourself in the mind of the people.
Well, and you go back to the first friction you talked about, inertia. I mean, one of the reasons people feel the friction of inertia is because something, to your point, is unfamiliar. It feels very different from what I know. And one of the remedies for overcoming inertia is to make unfamiliar things feel more familiar. Whether the person talking to them about it is more familiar or the product or service itself is more familiar. And you mentioned Steve Jobs, and you mentioned actually desks, which is an interesting segue. The reason that Apple OSs are designed the way they are, where the home screen is called a desktop, and the fact that you put files in folders and you put files in trash cans, it was designed to work the way the rest of your world works. So you don't have to learn how to Control Alt F2, put something in a C drive. Like, PCs make you learn an entirely new taxonomy and a new way of working in order to use them effectively. Apple OSs work the way the rest of your world works, which is why we consider them intuitive and why the inertia affiliated with them is minimized. And there's a phrase that I'm sure you're familiar with we talk about in design, which is meeting people where they are. Sometimes, to your point, even though it's innovative, you don't have to come forward with all of the fancy bells and whistles. The more familiar you can make it, the easier it is for somebody to get on board with adopting it.
You mentioned that your co-author works in either psychology or sort of that aspect. The two of you working together, one from the design side and in entrepreneurship, the other one from more of the what's happening inside people's brain sides. Were there any interesting insights that you got from each other? Perhaps in this case, you learned from him that you really weren't expecting.
Oh, I learned, I mean, the whole process of writing this book has been enormously valuable for me. And I think that there's something pretty magical about writing or creating something where not only can you tell people what they might do, but you can explain to them why they should do it or why things work the way they do. When I first got into academia, coming from the practitioner side, I used to come up with, here's a framework you can use, here's a tool you can use. And then I started realizing that that way of teaching was incomplete, because why something works or that something works doesn't necessarily help people understand how or why it works. So the psychological underpinnings of these principles are absolutely essential. And Loran, being a behavioral psychologist and a really talented one at that, brings a ton of background information, not like boring rote, like, and here's the theory that supports this, but explaining what goes on in human brains that make them feel these ways that honestly defy our logic and frankly defy our intuition. And when you understand why people look at things the way they do or why they experience the friction they experience, oftentimes the solution to overcoming those problems is pretty obvious. And so Loran's expertise on helping us understand why things are the way they are really shines a light on opportunities about how to quickly and easily make changes.
One of my sort of favorite fields of research in recent times, understanding how creativity works, is around understanding the biases that exist in our brains and the heuristics that we use. Unfortunately, it seems that a lot of these exist in our brains because they evolved to protect us, and therefore they can be quite hard to break.
Yeah, it's true. And in fact, one of the things that you'll find when you read this book, Loran is a keen observer of the animal world and the animal kingdom. And almost in every chapter, there's an example, not only of human psychology, but how these things tend to show up in other parts of the natural world. I mean, these challenges that we face are not unique to human beings alone. Some of them are quite fundamental to a lot of different sentient living organisms. And so it's interesting to see how these principles play out equally in humans and in, shellfish.
So what's the example with shellfish?
So the example from shellfish is around effort. We talk about in the chapter of effort, the path of least effort being the one that people typically follow. And Loran gives this great example of shore crabs. And the shore crab being a very finicky eater, the shore crab typically feasts on mussels, but there's only specific types of mussels that the shore crab will eat. Like mussels that are too small require the same amount of effort that mussels that are larger size require, but offer a smaller meal. Mussels that are too big require way more effort than the shore crab can exert, and sometimes risks them cracking their claws and imperiling themselves to a way that's usually meeting with a tragic end. And there's this sort of Goldilocks mussel in the middle that is like the perfect size for the right amount of nutrition and also easy enough to open. And so shore crabs just migrate to these things that kind of fit this benefit cost, that sort of nail this equilibrium between benefit and cost. And humans tend to do the same thing too. We tend to follow the path that offers us the most benefit for the minimum possible effort. And that's not always the one with the best long-term benefit for us. But if we know that human beings tend to operate similarly to shore crabs, the way that we might make unfamiliar things feel more familiar, or the way that we might make things that can be effortful less effortful, it typically is the deciding factor between success and failure.
So let's take it back from animals to humans. I assume there's also some case studies in here, maybe not Apple when we talked about them already, but are there any companies that are held up as a good example of a company that was struggling because they didn't realize the frictions, and then what they realized and how they overcame it?
Yeah, there's a bunch in the book. There's one in particular that I just got done doing an interview on, so it's front of mind. It's a company in the United States called Fly Homes. And at least in the US, we are in one of the most competitive real estate markets that has ever existed. Debt is cheap, inventory is low, which leads to a really competitive market. And typically anytime that you want to, if you're interested in buying a new house, not only do you have to make a decision the first day you see the house, but typically the buyers that are winning these deals are ones that come with all cash offers, meaning they don't have contingencies on loans. And in the mind of a seller, when you've got a loan contingency, that brings risk and that brings uncertainty that the deal will actually close. So a lot of home buyers who would like to buy a home that have a lot of credit worthiness are unable to actually purchase the homes they desire because they can't compete with these all cash buyers. And to make a long story short, Fly Homes, which started its business model in a very different way, adding features and benefits and sizzle and cashback and airline points for home purchases, has pivoted their business model over, instead of adding fuel or adding benefits to why the people should buy a home with them, to being laser focused on removing all of the friction that exists in the home buying process for both the buyer and the seller. And by migrating over from fuel creation to friction removal, their business has just ballooned and they're doing billions of dollars in transactions. They've just raised another $150 million round, growing like crazy, ever since they changed their business model from fuel creation to friction removal. And we see this a lot. The businesses that are winning in this day and age aren't just the ones that are adding features and benefits, but the ones that are consciously making it easier for people to make the change that they desire.
I saw a very interesting piece of research recently about how innovators approach problems. And apparently humans are hardwired to try and solve problems by adding more. So they either try and improve a passage of text by adding more text or adding more features, whereas quite often the way to improve it is to just remove what isn't working to be left with the best and clearest solution.
That's exactly right. There's a section in the book we talk about thinking about the world like a UX designer thinks about the world, and sometimes less is much, much more. Sometimes more is the opposite of what you want, and simplicity shouldn't be undervalued.
David, it's been wonderful speaking with you. Is there any sort of other last case study that you really smile every time you think about before we? Well,
I'll leave this as a cliffhanger. One of the opening examples we use in the book is studying the world's most successful car salesperson, a guy named Ali Rada, who works at Les Sanford Chevrolet in Detroit, Michigan, who outsells every other car dealer, the average car dealer in the United States, by about 15 to 1. And the way in which he approaches car sales and the way he thinks about friction is really insightful and intuitive. And for those of you who are interested in learning, I'm happy to send you a sample chapter. If you go to humanelementbook.com, or email me directly. My email's on the faculty page of the Kellogg website. I'd be delighted to send you that chapter as a little bit of a appetizer for the book that comes out on October 5th.
David, humanelementbook.com, your faculty page, any other websites you'd like to highlight where people can get to find out more about you?
Those are probably the best places to begin, and usually you can find other places from there.
Perfect. Dave, it's been wonderful having you here today. And I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Perhaps in person in Berlin one of these days.
Absolutely. Cheers then.
Cheers,
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they're backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.